GB News.
Thank you, Catherine Forster, GB News. Reform has a habit of making announcements that sound, on the face of it, very appealing to a lot of people. But you talk about jailing the bosses of multinational companies. Given that nobody has gone to jail for the post office scandal or infected blood scandal or the financial crisis or for Grenfell, how are we really supposed to believe that you would send any of these bosses to jail? And also, if I may, Morgan McSweeney, who used to be absolutely obsessed with the threat from reform, has said this week that he thinks the next election will be between Labour and the Conservatives. What's your response to that, please? Thank you.
Okay, so Morgan McSweeney, it's always been fascinating that people keep telling me how smart Morgan McSweeney is. I think the entire reign of Keir Starmer is evidence to the contrary, so I would pay little attention to that. In terms of the previous track record of governments in Britain prosecuting people who should have been prosecuted, especially very rich and powerful people, the catastrophic failures of the Tory and Labour government should not be a reason for you to doubt what reform can do. In fact, it's why reform are where we are. The British public are sick and tired of it. So what it comes down to is passing the correct legislation and then making sure that we're actually serious about doing those things. I mean, listen, we would rather, if you gave us a choice between putting every fat cat executive in jail and ensuring there were no illegal migrants working in Britain, we choose no illegal migrants working in Britain. What this is going to do is create a similarity in regime between serious financial crime, in terms of making it strict liability, and hiring illegal migrants. Even, for example, the cost, just to get ahead of a question that might come in about the costs of this. Yes, we are talking about significant increases in costs for agencies, for police to ensure that we can do the things we're saying. But we're also talking about a massive punitive fine regime. And what we will do is allow these agencies to keep the fines that they generate, aside from the money that goes to the people who gave them tips, if those came in. That's a very similar regime to the Financial Conduct Authority, for example, which is reasonably good. It's bad at many things, but it's actually reasonably good at cracking down on financial crime. Damien from BBC.
Yeah, Yusuf over here. Damien from BBC. Can I ask a couple of questions about the practicalities you're talking about? You talked there about having combined teams which would have the power to enter somewhere, it seems without a warrant, seize people and issue a deportation order with no question about how that could be, that would not be followed through. How are you going to ensure that there aren't mistakes, that people aren't seized and deported who are mistakenly being deported? We've seen that in the US with the ICE force. So how's this going to be any different to that? You also you make it sound tough about licenses and saying people shouldn't be allowed to have licenses. They're already not allowed beyond 12 months in the UK on a foreign license, whether it's some you can swap directly, some you can get a provisional license. It's only EU countries that you can drive for longer in the UK than 12 months on a foreign license. So isn't that just sounding tough? But unless you're going to target EU citizens, you're not really making a difference there. And sorry, can I just ask one other question?
Go on.
I mean, there's been a lot of talk this week about a possible pact or something with Restore Britain. Can I just ask you personally? I mean, one of the reasons for the falling out, I think, was that Rupert Lowe, there was a report made or an accusation made that he had threatened you specifically, and that was one thing police followed up. He's asked that differences are put aside. Will you put that aside? And do you think that's worth doing to have a pact? Okay, so in terms of how do you ensure mistakes aren't made, the key is making sure that these agencies are operating with the correct data. Okay, so part of the premise of your question is, well, if you're going to do things quickly, that might mean mistakes are going to be made. Okay, that's the underlying premise of your question. And I would respond with the only way that would be true is if somebody was making decisions with either insufficient data or incorrect data. Now, the policy we've announced today comes in the context of policies we have already announced, including an all-new legislative regime for immigration, namely what me and Nigel announced last summer, Operation
restoring justice. So for starters, they will be operating with data from a host of agencies, and by the way, bringing together data including from places like HMRC and the NHS too. We will focus all of the state's resources on tracking down every single person in Britain who is here illegally, which is a gargantuan task, and that's really important to say. The second thing is, one of the reasons why there's almost no instances where somebody commits a crime, for example, which should result in their deportation, and them actually being deported, is because of endless lawsuits, endless resistance from a judicial perspective, and we are going to clear the decks legislatively to make sure that that doesn't happen. Now, if your question to me is what happens if someone is there's a mistaken identity or something, well, we've no interest in letting that happen. We won't let that happen. On the exceptionally rare instance that it does happen, we would obviously correct that very quickly. But that's not what we're talking about. Currently, there's almost no enforced deport. It's actually astonishingly difficult. I mean, there are cases I could name for you where British women have been raped by foreign nationals, and the British state is incapable of even deporting them. So what hope do we do of someone running a vape shop? In terms of answering your question about the license, the driving licenses, that's an extremely complex legal regime. And again, I would go back to the point, what is the level of enforcement? There are so many laws and rules and regulations in this country that, yes, they may exist on the statute book somewhere, but either they get overridden by a law that is perceived as superior, for example, the ECHR, or the elements of the ECHR which were embedded into British law by Tony Blair. These are all things that a reformed government would undo. In terms of the point about Rupert and Restore, look, my feelings towards Rupert pale into insignificance relative to the mission to turn around the country. There are tens of millions of British people who see the country we love slipping away from us, the country we were born in and raised in slipping away from us, who want secure borders, who want the mass deportation of illegal migrants, who want severe criminal penalties for those who contribute to the undermining of British workers. I could go on. So I think that's what we should focus on. Rob Powell.
Sorry, just
yeah.
Clarify, I mean, on the deportation, the question exactly was not the assumptions you're making. It was the question about mistaken identity. You said you would correct that. So how are you going to correct that if you're not making any checks? Or are you talking about deporting people and then bringing them back?
Yeah, so what we will ensure cannot happen. So again, we've got to look at what the current situation is, right? Rather than ask a hypothetical about a 0.001% likelihood scenario. So what currently happens, as I said, is the British state cannot even deport people, foreign nationals, who have come to this country, overstayed their visa, or come in many cases, on a small boat illegally in the first place, and committed the most despicable and grave crimes imaginable. Why? Again, because of all of the things we're aware of, the ECHR, and then many of those aspects of the ECHR that are also embedded into British law, which is why simply leaving the ECHR is not enough. Okay? So that's the first point. We will ensure that we have the correct identification of these people as we lay out in Operation Restoring Justice. We're going to work with foreign countries and their embassies to help us do that. We will also ensure that they will never, so if you are in the country illegally or you came to the country illegally, you will have no ability to appeal based on the merits of your asylum claim, because your asylum claim will be rendered null and void by virtue of the fact that you came to Britain illegally, which is what should be the case given the Immigration Act of 1971. It's just that, as I said, Tory and Labour governments have just decided not to enforce that. Okay? But to answer your question directly, in an extraordinarily rare, look, if we're going to deport well north of 1 million people, that is Reform's plan, you're going to get a very rare occasion where a mistake is made. And what I'm saying to you is a British government, a Nigel Farage government, we've got no interest in deporting people who should not have been deported due to mistaken identity. We would correct it. Rob Powell, Sky News.
Thank you. Rob Powell, Sky News. Reform have talked in the past about removing red tape and paperwork, things like that for businesses to allow them to hire. What extra checks and documentations would businesses of all sizes need to do to make sure that they were legit, essentially, and avoid these draconian fines under this tighter regime? And a lot of this criticism is obviously aimed at Deliveroo. You've named the law after Deliveroo, or the possible law anyway. Would you rather if people didn't use Deliveroo and gig economy services like that, and do you use them yourself?
in terms of do I use them? Would we ask other people not to use them? That's not relevant here, right? Here's the really relevant thing. We want people creating jobs in this country. We want people to create businesses in this country. We want people to start startups like Deliveroo in this country. We want multinational companies like Uber to come to Britain and to succeed. However, there is a bright red line on everything I've just said, which is hiring illegal migrants, and in some cases at industrial scale. I want to reiterate to you, the official data from an enforcement action found north of 40%. 40% of them were found to be working illegally, right? Not 4%, 40. The notion that these executives and these directors would be unaware of this, or incapable of stopping it, to respond to, the part about enforcement. I mean, Deliveroo pitches itself as a technology company. It's more than capable of stopping it. The fact of the matter is, as I said in my speech, for a lot of these companies, and it isn't just Deliveroo, a lot of these companies, they see whatever fines they may get, whatever negative attention they might get for doing it, as a minor inconvenience and a small cost of doing business. So yes, people want to enjoy those services, great. If those companies want to come here and expand, or people want to start startups in those areas, great. Do not commit immigration fraud. That's our message. And in terms of incremental, quote, red tape, as Richard and as Rob have talked about a lot, as has Nigel, you're going to see probably the biggest reduction in red tape, in particularly for small and medium-sized businesses in this country, under reform government within the space of months. But again, I draw a bright red line here. One area where, yes, we are going to increase the level of scrutiny and make sure that you are compliant without exception, is immigration law, in no small part because that's exactly, if reform win the next general election, it would have been won with a mandate such as that. Natasha Clark, LBC.
Hi, Zia. Natasha Clark, LBC. You've said there, and you just talked to Rob about people facing fines and those companies facing fines, even if they don't know that they are hiring illegal workers. How will you be able to essentially enforce that? What will the companies have to say to essentially give you that evidence that you need to say that they will know that they are hiring those illegal workers? How can you say that this will be a fair policy for them? Yep. And if I may, Westminster Council today, you talked about pubs in your speech, have said that they want to give more licences to pubs that might shut early by 10 p.m. and could look to penalise drinking standing up, as a party who I think many of your supporters will agree is very much in support of the pub. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, look, Reform UK, our posture is we are pro-pubs. I think that we've made that quite clear. We've announced a policy that would dramatically reduce business rates, for example, for pubs. And it's actually, there's a broader concern here. Part of my speech was, what kind of Britain are our young people growing up in? And places, sort of shared space where people can go and socialise with friends, are in ever-dwindling supply in this country. And there's a straight line between that and what people call the mental health crisis for young people, the fact that they're not dating. There's a lot of problems there and I think these things are connected. In terms of how do you make sure the policy is fair, I want to be really clear about something. Reform has not introduced a novel standard of justice here. What we're doing is simply mirroring what already exists for serious financial crime. What we're saying is, so for example, if you are a director of a financial organisation in which there ends up being significant, really serious financial crime, you can be held personally liable, even if you were not personally aware of those things going on, because the burden of proof, or the burden of the expectation is that you are taking the correct steps within your organisation to see to it that that crime does not happen. So all we are doing is drawing parity between serious financial crime and immigration fraud at industrial scale. I personally think they are at least worthy of being in parity, and I think there are many people in this country who agree with that. Christian Calgi, Daily Mail.
Morning, Zia. You alluded earlier to a significant increase in costs related to this policy. Do you have any numerical details on what that might be expected to be and how that's being funded? Yep. And do you have a response to Kemi Badenoch branding reform woke and a grievance party full of victim narratives and moaning and whinging?
Okay, so in terms of costs, so we estimate the total cost ramped over a period of time for incremental enforcement resource to be in the region of 400 to 500 million. However, as I said, again, a lot of this has been modelled off what the FCA does and financial crime. So just as the FCA gets to keep the proceeds of enforcement actions that it generates, we would do the same with this. So we actually expect broadly the cost, this policy to be cost neutral, just given the gargantuan scale of the problem at the moment. Yeah, look, I don't think Kemi's had the best few days, and she's obviously lashed out at reform and started calling us names. She said that we're a party that has, that we have grievances. I would agree with that. We do have a grievance. We have a grievance with the fact that they spent 14 years lying to the British public. They said they'd reduce legal immigration down to the tens of thousands, left office with that number at 1 million, shipped in 1 million people gross, 6 million people net, built 400 prison places net to cope with that, and then has the gall to go on telly with victims of serious crime and complain about early release when they released tens of thousands of people early, including people who committed serious crime. They allowed 130,000 illegal migrants to come here by boat. I mean, Chris Philp went out to the Channel to sort of go and point. I mean, that's sort of I think there's terms in criminal psychology about people who go back to the scene of the crime in some sort of odd display of narcissism. I mean, the Tories are responsible for the majority of the illegal boats that have come to this country, the majority of the illegal migrants, and everyone who Chris Philp filmed and interacted with were basically travelling a trail that he had created for them. Even his interactions with the French. No British government has paid the French more to stop the boats than the Tories. So, I mean, the whole thing is absurd on its face, and that is why I maintain my view that the Tories, as of the next general election, will no longer be a serious and credible national political party. Genevieve at the Telegraph.
Hi, Zia. Thank you. So, first of all, you mentioned stopping those with foreign driver's licenses from using commercial vehicles, and the companies would be fine. Would that include lorry drivers, for example, and any kind of major delivery drivers? Secondly, you've already just mentioned there the early release scheme and the ongoing upset, not only from the family of PC Harper, but also the force that he used to work for, that his killers are still eligible for early release. Would you back calls for a specific carve-out where those who have killed emergency service workers, such as PC Harper, be exempt from early release? Thank you.
Okay, so firstly, there will be no industry or sub-industry exempt from our immigration laws. So that's the first point. In terms of your second point, I think it's absolutely disgusting that somebody who killed a police officer, the fact that we've been talking about releasing this person early it makes me sick to my stomach. And it's why I go back to the point, of course, Labour have been an absolute disaster on this, and I think it's objectively true that they are making a bad situation worse. That is without doubt true. But it is also true that the Tories imported 6 million people net, that's the net number, through immigration, and built 455 net new prison places. Not 455,000, 455. Okay, so no, I'm not going to call out for call for a carve out just for that small sliver. They should never be allowed out. As you're going to hear from us in the coming week, we will have far more things to say about this. We think the concept of people who commit serious crime, rape, murder, of anybody, the idea that these people should get to leave their jail sentence early is totally unacceptable. It is against everything reform stands for. But we'll have more to say on that in the coming week. Michael Knowles at The Express.
Thank you, Zia. You mentioned potential rewards for people that effectively tip off the authorities about dodgy businesses. How much are you looking to potentially pay people for doing so. And I think you touched on your answer to Natasha, but the Prevent statistics this morning show a sharp increase in children being referred to for alleged extremist views. Why do you think that is? What's sitting behind that data?
So, in terms of percentages, again, we looked at regimes like what the SEC does in America. And so what they have created a regime in which they've created a very strong incentive. Essentially, it's an uncapped commission program in America if you tip them off to serious financial crime, where they are able to generate significant fines from that as a result of criminal conduct. So in terms of the exact percentage, that will be in the final legislation that we pass. We're going to look at what the SEC have done. If you look at that, that's going to be a sensible ballpark. In terms of Prevent's data, I mean, the first thing I would say is, look, Prevent's totally unfit for purpose. I'm deeply skeptical of any data that Prevent is putting out, because as I talked about in my speech a few months ago, if you look at Sir Shawcross's report into Prevent, and when I read that document, I was sort of taken aback. I mean, he said that Prevent had a, quote, institutional hesitancy to investigate Islamist extremism, which for a body that's supposed to be the first line of defense against terrorism, and given that the vast majority of MI5's caseload is Islamist terrorism, I genuinely cannot think of a worse indictment that you could give of an organization. It has essentially become a glorified social work program, which is why, many, sadly, several high-profile savages who have gone on to commit brutal mass casualty attacks were on Prevent's radar, and nothing was done about it. So that would be the first thing. In terms of young people, look, I think that broadly, my understanding is if you look through history, obviously, young people are always going to be perhaps more impressionable to these things. But I would say, look, the way we solve these problems, you can try to address them at sort of a grand national sort of societal level, and I get it, there are things that we can do with that. But if we have a reformed government and I'm the Home Secretary, I'm going to focus on making sure, for example, Prevent is fit for purpose. And one of the policies I've already announced is their resources. They will be mandated to deploy resources in proportion to MI5's caseload at any given time, right? So rather than, perhaps turning a blind or having a, quote, institutional hesitancy, as Sir Shawcross put it, so you don't use my words, you can use his in his independent report, over something like Islamist extremism, they will be forced to and they will deploy the majority of their resource on ensuring that scourge in this country is rooted out. Tom Scottson, The Sun.
Thank you. If the companies do not pay the fines, this is the 10% turnover, would you threaten shutting companies down and stopping operating within Britain? And my second question was on Rupert Lowe. You said that your past disagreement kind of paled into insignificance. And I just wondered, do you now regret raising the alarm about him and Reform kicking him out of the party?
Okay, so in terms of if a company chooses not to pay the fines, or is incapable of paying the fines rendered on them as a result of hiring illegal migrants, they would expect to be enforced upon, and that would include all the way up to being dissolved and being struck off, basically. Yeah, just like any other. It would be just like if they didn't pay their taxes. And again, it's interesting that you are. I always find it fascinating as someone who came out of the world of business that these questions are asked, because it is clearly the case that in areas like immigration and other, whether it's the driving license regime, there are laws that exist that just simply are not enforced. Whereas, again, anyone who's run a business, if you will know that you don't really get very far if you don't pay your tax. Try telling HMRC, I don't really fancy paying the taxes or the fines. Try doing that as a private individual. So we've got to create parity, between those two things. Look, again, with regards to the Rupert thing, I don't regret anything that I did. But, again, I want to reiterate here, again, a lot of the questions are about personalities and things like that. Look, I've dedicated my life to this. I do this as a volunteer. I do that with all of my time. I gave up all my business interests to do it. Richard does exactly the same thing. Nigel is doing exactly the same thing. We believe this in our hearts. We think that we've got a vanishing window of opportunity to to turn this country around. We think the next general election will be the most important general election fought in this country's history. We believe that in our bones. And so to put, I think that's the context that you've got to see any personal disagreements or personal difficulties. Isabel from Politico.
Hi, thank you. Since Monday's press conference, the French have said that the Navy plan would constitute a violation of French sovereignty, as well as a violation of the law of the sea and international law. Have you had any contact with the French government since Monday, or any other French politicians to discuss the plan? And if so, who, and could you give us some details?
Yeah, well, I'm happy to talk about things that are in the public domain. Less so talk about conversations that were private, especially given we are not yet the sovereign government of Britain. But Nigel Farage obviously did meet Jordan Bardella, for example, who certainly the polls would suggest is odds on to become, at the time, French president, now probably French prime minister. And he actually went on the record. You can go and look it up. He said that he would be very open to the idea of a Farage government returning boats back to France. So that'll be the first point. But I also would say, our position at Reform is that while, of course, we want to cooperate with our friends in Europe and France, wherever we can, on all matters, including border security and immigration, we are unwilling to allow the Élysée Palace, or anybody else for that matter, any foreign government, to determine whether Britain gets to have a border or not. And we've got a really strong view on this. So it is up to the British government to ensure that we have a border. And what was really interesting when I read that statement, I kind of laughed, because here's the French government coming out and saying, we're going to stand up for our sovereignty. The French government, the Élysée Palace, saying we're going to stand up for French sovereignty. Well, what about Britain's sovereignty? And I wouldn't expect the French government to care about that. They clearly don't. I would expect, call me unreasonable, I would expect the British government to care a bit about our own sovereignty. So north of 200,000 illegal migrants have left French shores and come to Britain. You'd have seen, I know it was a former Tory minister who shot the video, but the French authorities ushering them onto boats, explicitly saying on video that they've been told to basically let them go. And this isn't just about basically an invasion of north of 200,000 people in the space of 8 years. It is the composition of these people. Most of them come from Iraq, Iran, Syria, and Afghanistan. The fact that we know nothing about them, and the risk, let's call it the stochastic risk of what could happen as a result of them coming. So we already know some have come here illegally by boat from France and savagely murdered British citizens like Rhiannon White, who was working in an illegal migrant hotel and was stabbed 23 times with a screwdriver by a Sudanese man who, again, came here illegally by boat. We know that some of the people leaving French shores and coming here illegally, presumably under the watch of the French authorities, as we saw in those videos, have gone on to attempt mass casualty terrorist attacks in this country. Again, that's not a hypothetical. We know that that has happened, and the only reason those mass casualty attacks did not succeed is due to the brilliance of our security services. So I fully expect France to put out statements, maybe bombastic statements, reiterating the importance of their own sovereignty. When was the last time we had a British government doing the same on behalf of the British people? We're unwilling to accept that any foreign country would get to decide whether Britain has a border. And I also want to address, we have said, look, we would much rather that the French cooperate with this, right? But make no mistake, we do envisage a scenario in our document, in Operation Fortress, in which they don't. And what we have said is Royal Marines will return the migrants that they pick up off those boats attempting to come to Britain, every single one, and take them back to the shores, the very shore that they left in the morning in France. And, I think it's been put, I saw Andrew Neil sort of quote tweeted me saying, this is, quote, bonkers, right? Now, I get it that if you're someone like Andrew Neil who's been basically analysing British politics for decades, you assume no British government can do anything of any sort, right? But I will say this. Number one, I think it's absolutely bonkers to allow the status quo to continue. How many need to come illegally before we decide our armed forces are necessary? Is it 1 million? Is it 2? Is it 5? There must be an answer. But also, he basically said what would happen is the French would respond with their armed forces, and talked about the relative size of the French armed forces versus ours. So what Andrew Neil and others who are making such an argument that the French would respond with some kind of with some sort of threat and prevent those boats making the shore, we've got to understand what they are proposing the French would do. They are proposing that the French would threaten and push back out into choppy, high tide waters a boat which is full of innocent civilians with a couple of Royal Marines on board. Now, make no mistake, not only forget about laws of the sea, that is a crime against humanity. And I am not President Macron's biggest fan. I think there is no chance that he would do such a thing. The reality is, there is a reality in which they're not particularly happy and we have a big diplomatic row, for sure. That, we fully accept that. But that's what it would be. Some comparison about the size of our relative size of our armed forces is absolutely ridiculous. And the final thing I'll say about this, again, coming from the world of business, if you're looking at something that has just been a massively persistent problem for a business or an industry for a prolonged period of time, you don't solve that problem with tinkering, with increments. You solve it with a significant step change and out-of-the-box thinking, which is exactly what the reform plan would deliver. And Chris from the Press Association.
Thanks, Chris McKeon, PA. I also wanted to ask about Monday's announcement, given that we know the Royal Navy struggles to meet its existing commitments, and the offshore patrol vessels you're thinking of using already have a lot to do defending Britain from Russian activity around our waters, protecting fisheries, protecting the Falklands, a few other things. So, specifically, which of the Navy's existing commitments are you thinking of abandoning or scaling back in order to implement this policy?
Okay. Really easy way to answer that question. Again, I'm fascinated to see that there are many, particularly in the establishment talking heads, saying, our Navy has already got a lot to do. My response is simple. What could be more important a mission for His Majesty's Royal Navy than preserving the borders of the United Kingdom? I can't think of one. And so, number one, we're going to prioritise our border. We're going to stop the boats from coming. And one thing I should have mentioned, actually, in terms of the feasibility and viability of this, one of the only people in the world, certainly one of the only, maybe the only world leader in the world, who can say that they stopped a small boat illegal migrant crisis, former Prime Minister of Australia, Tony Abbott, has come out and endorsed our plan and said not only can it be done, he has said that it must be done. And so I would place a higher weight on somebody who's actually done the thing than a bunch of, theorists and technocrat talking heads who have actually never delivered any, from what I can tell in many cases, delivered any positive result in any endeavour they've been involved in. In terms of the, thinking about the Navy's broader capacity and capability here, I've also heard that, our Navy isn't capable of doing it. Now, there was a YouGov poll, and I know we have our disagreement. I don't think we're their biggest fan nor the other way around, but there was a YouGov poll that said, I think 2/3, 2 in 3 British people believe that putting the Royal Navy in the Channel as reform has proposed would reduce the number of boat crossings. And the British public are very smart. It's pretty clear that the notion that His Majesty's Royal Navy would be utterly incapable of stopping dinghies with unarmed people inside is just absurd on its face. When they're not taking on Russian warships, they're basically conducting a humanitarian mission, which they have done with aplomb in plenty of places around the world, including in Africa during the anti-piracy missions. So look, the Navy's absolutely capable of doing it. Does it need a lot more funding? For sure, absolutely. But that is something that reform is going to focus on as well, we when in government. Okay, that's all the questions? Yeah, okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Just a couple of things just strike me just listening to that. I mean, on the boats, you just said in answer to one question that it would be migrant boats with a couple of Royal Navy Marines on landing on the shore. Right. Is that your policy? Are you suggesting that the Marines would climb onto a dinghy full of migrants and then steer it or tell them to steer it back?
No, so the other way around. So yeah, go on, answer your question.
Well, there's a follow-up. There's a the other thing is just on the, again, listening to the licence thing, a large part of our economy exists because it depends on trade with Europe, trucks coming across, large amounts of goods coming this way and that way, licence holders both ways. So are you saying that someone with a Czech licence, a Polish licence, a Bulgarian
Okay, so there's a fundamental difference between somebody who is, quote unquote, earning a living in this country and somebody who is transiting in this country in order to deliver a product, right? So that would be the first thing to say there. And I want to reiterate, the licensing regime in this country, A, is complicated, but the original question you asked me, during, what, about 20 minutes ago, you put it to me that, well, this thing is already not allowed. But I want to reiterate that just like so many other offences that you might reasonably categorise as perhaps more minor, they are overridden by manifold regulations and laws, again, going back to the ECHR and the regime Blair created. So that's what we're talking about, ensuring that people, A, follow the rules, and B, that there are consequences for people that do not. In terms of your question about the... Yeah.
You just overridden your policy with an exemption that says people coming through and transiting can use it. So you're already creating complications to make it...
No, because again, we're talking about companies operating in the UK, right? So there is a fundamental difference between people who are operating in what you'd call during the ordinary course of business, where their fundamental business is in the UK, and people who are coming here, to, for example, deliver a product. There are fundamental differences between those two things.
So you're going to have to then check all sorts of complications. Are you one of these? Are you not one of these? Do you have an exemption somewhere? It's going to get complicated.
Why would it be complicated?
You said that there's exemptions for people who are not working for a company that's lawfully transiting through the UK.
Mm-hmm.
So you're going to have to find ways to...
But what you're referring to there, again, is a data problem, right? And so, again, this is what... And you can actually see the areas of success, for example, in America, where ICE has had success and the DHS has had success. It is by bringing together a whole multitude of data sets that were not previously speaking to each other. So the world we're talking about is not one where it's going to take weeks in order to determine somebody's immigration status, right? Or if they're operating lawfully in the context of them being a foreign national. We will be able to determine that very, very quickly. Okay? In terms of the naval operation, yeah, so the first thing to say is the plan was devised by a number of senior former members of our armed forces. It's been endorsed by a number of senior members of our armed forces, including the Navy, and we've put those, I think, on page 3 of the document. And what we envisage happening, something the Royal Navy has done frequently before, so again, there's nothing novel about this. You have these river-class offshore patrol vessels, and then you have these RHIBs, which are rigid-hulled inflatable boats. Those are highly maneuverable. They're very small. They can go right up alongside these vessels, which are not particularly maneuverable, and frankly, most are not seaworthy, right, as we saw just a few days ago when one caught fire. So they would go up alongside. They would pick up those migrants and put them onto the Navy vessel. And we took a strong view on this because, as far as reform are concerned, the only acceptable number of casualties on an operation like this is 0. Okay? So we took it upon ourselves to say, we want to ensure nobody dies, no migrant perishes anymore. You look at what happened in Australia with Tony Abbott's plan, Operation Sovereign Borders. With that, I think it was 2007 to 2013, 1,200 migrants making the journey died. During Operation Sovereign Borders, again, a joint military operation to stop the boats from coming, 0 died, and he stopped the entire crisis within a period of weeks. So the Navy are more than capable of doing it, and we expect they will. Okay? We will take one more. Go on. Yeah. Yeah, look, we have answered. I mean, me, Richard, Nigel probably answered the same question about 300 times. So I think we will leave it there. Thank you very much, everyone. Cheers.